Story 1. The Silent Blizzard. Liam was driving home late one snowy evening, the only car on the winding road cutting through the dense, frost-covered woods. The snowstorm was growing heavier by the minute, and his car tires slipped dangerously on the icy surface. As his headlights barely illuminated the road ahead, he saw something strange. A woman standing by the side of the road, her white dress blending into the snow, her long hair whipping in the wind. She wasn't moving, but she was staring directly at his car. Concerned, he pulled over a few feet ahead and got out to help. "Are you all right? Do you need a ride?" he called out. But the woman didn't respond. The snow was falling so heavily now that he could barely see her anymore. As he stepped closer, she disappeared into the swirling white, leaving no footprints in the snow. Confused and unnerved, Liam got back into his car, locking the doors. He continued driving, the storm now a blinding curtain. Just as he calmed himself, the car suddenly jolted to a stop. He hadn't hit anything, but the engine had stalled. Frustrated, he tried turning the key again, but the battery was dead. That's when he noticed something horrifying. The woman was standing directly in front of his car, staring at him through the windshield. Her face was unnaturally pale, her eyes sunken, and her lips frozen in a faint, lifeless smile. Panic surged as Liam fumbled to start the car, but the woman was no longer outside. She was now sitting in the passenger seat, her icy fingers inches from his arm. Her lips moved, barely audible over the howling wind. "You shouldn't have stopped." When rescuers found Liam's car the next day, it was buried in snow, the engine cold. No one ever discovered what killed him, but his face was frozen in a mask of terror. Story 2. The Footprints in the Snow. Ava loved her quiet, secluded home deep in the countryside, especially in winter when the landscape turned into a serene, snow-covered paradise. One evening, as she sat by her window with a cup of tea, she noticed something odd. Footprints. They started at the edge of the woods and trailed all the way to her house, stopping directly outside her living room window. She frowned. It was too late for visitors, and the storm had been so bad that she doubted anyone would be wandering around. Nervously, she turned off the lights and peeked out through the curtains. The tracks were fresh, but no one was there. The following morning, Ava inspected the footprints. They weren't normal. Each print was deep, larger than a person's, and they seemed misshapen, as though whatever had made them had claws. She followed the trail into the woods, but found nothing, the footprints vanishing near a thicket of gnarled trees. That night, she was startled awake by a loud thud on her roof. It sounded like something heavy dragging itself across the shingles. She grabbed her flashlight and went outside, staring up at the roof. Nothing. But when she turned to go back inside, she froze. New footprints led from the forest to her back door, and there, in the snow, was a set of handprints pressed against the glass. She bolted the door, heart pounding, and backed away. The final blow came when she heard heavy breathing inside the house. She turned slowly, shining her flashlight. Behind her, a figure crouched in the shadows, its body twisted and wrong, its wide, toothy grin gleaming in the faint light. The next day, the police found her house empty. The only clue left behind were the same strange clawed footprints leading back into the woods. Story 3. The Whispering Snowfield. Ethan was a wildlife photographer searching for rare Arctic foxes deep in the Alaskan wilderness. He set up camp in the middle of a vast snowfield, miles from any other human being. The landscape was endless, untouched white, and eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made you feel like you were being watched. On his second night, as he reviewed his photographs by the fire, he heard a faint whisper carried by the wind. He brushed it off, thinking it was the sound of the wind cutting through the snow. But then, it came again, clearer this time. A voice, a woman's voice, softly calling his name. Ethan froze. He knew there was no one else around for miles. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside his tent, scanning the snowfield. Nothing but the endless expanse of white. Then, in the distance, he saw something moving. A pale, blurry figure was gliding silently over the snow, just at the edge of his visibility. Curiosity got the better of him, and he followed the figure into the snowfield. No footprints marked where it had been, and as he got closer, it seemed to dissolve into the snow, only to reappear further away. The whispering grew louder now, surrounding him, calling him deeper into the storm. Hours later, rescuers found Ethan's campsite abandoned, the fire long extinguished. His camera was left behind, but the memory card contained one last photo, a blurry, ghostly figure with hollow eyes, staring directly at the lens. Ethan was never seen again. Story 4: The Frozen Ones. Claire loved ice climbing and thought a solo trip to the mountains in winter would be the perfect challenge. She had heard of an infamous cliffside called the Frozen Wall, named for its treacherous sheet of permanent ice. Legend said climbers who ventured there alone never came back, but Claire dismissed it as folklore. On her second day of climbing, she felt uneasy. The wind howled strangely, and every so often she'd see something in her peripheral vision. Shapes etched in the ice, faint faces frozen mid-scream. When she reached a ledge to rest, she set up camp and lit a fire, but her unease grew stronger. The shadows from her fire seemed to stretch too far, like figures moving just outside its glow. That night, she woke to a scraping sound outside her tent. Opening the flap, she found nothing but her footprints, and dozens of others circling her tent, prints far too deep to be human. Shaking, she climbed back into her sleeping bag and zipped it shut. The next day, as she scaled the final part of the ice wall, the whispers began, faint and distant, but unmistakably voices. The faces she thought she imagined were clearer now, staring at her from the ice, hundreds of them, their mouths open as if gasping for air. Suddenly her rope jerked. She looked down to find no one holding the other end, but the rope began pulling her upward, toward the faces. Her screams echoed in the mountains, but no one heard her. Months later, another climber reached the frozen wall and swore they saw Claire, her face trapped in the ice, her mouth open in a silent scream. Story 5: The Lake Beneath. A group of friends rented a cabin near a frozen lake to celebrate New Year's Eve. The lake was massive, and the locals had warned them not to venture too far out because of thin ice. Ignoring the warnings, they spent the first night skating and laughing under the moonlight. On the second day, they noticed something strange, dark shapes moving under the ice, circling below them. Probably fish, one of them joked, but the shapes were too large and moved in unnatural patterns. That night, as the storm rolled in, they heard strange knocking sounds against the cabin walls, but when they looked outside, there was nothing. The next morning, they found claw marks etched into the ice leading from the lake to their front door. The youngest of the group, Ashley, insisted on returning to the lake, drawn by something she couldn't explain. Against her friends' protests, she went alone and stood on the ice. Moments later, she screamed and disappeared, as if something beneath the lake had yanked her under. The group panicked and ran to the frozen surface, but there was no hole, no sign of Ashley, just the faint sound of laughter echoing under the ice. When they tried to leave, the car wouldn't start, and the storm trapped them. By the time rescuers arrived, the cabin was empty. On the lake, faint footsteps led from the shore to the center, where the ice had cracked, but no one was ever found. Ends Story 6: The Window Watcher. Megan hated living in her parents' old farmhouse, especially during the long winters when snow trapped them inside for weeks. The house was surrounded by dense woods, and she often felt like someone was watching her. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, Megan was lying in bed when she heard a faint tapping sound on her bedroom window. Thinking it was the wind, she ignored it, but the tapping became more insistent, rhythmic. She pulled back the curtain to find nothing but snow-covered darkness. The next night, it happened again. This time, she swore she saw a shadow pass by the window, a tall, thin figure. She told her parents, but they dismissed her, saying the wind could play tricks on her eyes. On the third night, the tapping was louder. Megan finally worked up the courage to open the window slightly. But when she did, she saw large footprints in the snow outside, leading from the woods to her window. Trembling, she slammed it shut. That was when she heard it, a whisper behind her. "I've been waiting for you." She turned, but no one was there. The next morning, her parents found her room empty, the window wide open, and the footprints leading back into the woods.